Join me as I dive deep into the emotional disconnect of Generation X and try to figure out what really makes them tick. Here's something surprising. Despite growing up before smartphones, despite valuing independence, despite being known as the self-reliant generation, Generation X reports to some of the highest levels of loneliness among adults today. Not because they lack connections, but because many of those connections feel emotionally thin. They're surrounded by people, they're digitally connected, yet emotionally, many feel distant. So how did a generation raised to be fine end up feeling so disconnected? That's what we're unpacking. Emotional disconnection in Generation X isn't a trend. It's not a personality flaw, and it didn't appear overnight. It's the result of a specific psychological environment shaped quietly by history, culture, and survival. In a fast-paced world obsessed with self-expression and emotional openness, Generation X often seems out of sync. Not because they don't feel deeply, but because they learned early not to show it. To understand that disconnect, we have to go back, not to blame, but to observe. Generation X grew up in a world that demanded emotional efficiency. Many were raised during periods of economic instability, rising divorce rates, dual income or absent households, and increasing social pressure to handle things yourself. Emotional needs weren't ignored out of cruelty, they were often ignored out of necessity. Parents were working, systems were stretched, time was limited. So children adapted. Instead of asking, they observed. Instead of expressing, they internalized. Instead of relying on others, they learned to self-regulate. Over time, this didn't just shape behavior, it shaped identity. Being emotionally independent became a strength, needing less became a virtue, silence became maturity. But that adaptation came with a cost. Because emotional disconnection doesn't mean the absence of emotion, it means emotions had nowhere safe to go. Today, Generation X sits in a unique position. They are parents to emotionally expressive generations, children of emotionally restrained ones, and workers in systems that reward productivity over presence. They are expected to communicate openly, adapt emotionally, and lead with empathy. Yet many were never taught the emotional language required to do so. This creates a silent tension. They appear stable, capable, functional, but internally, many feel misunderstood, even by themselves. And that's why emotional disconnection isn't just a personal issue, it's generational. For Generation X, emotional self-reliance wasn't encouraged, it was assumed. Crying too much? You'll get over it. Feeling overwhelmed? Life is hard. Need reassurance? Figure it out. Over time, this teaches a powerful lesson. Your emotions are your responsibility alone. That belief creates adults who don't burden others, don't ask for emotional support, and don't easily articulate vulnerability. Not because they don't want connection, but because connection was never framed as safe. Ask many Gen X adults how they're doing, and you'll hear it. I'm fine. Not great, not terrible, just fine. This isn't avoidance, it's emotional compression. Fine means functioning, not asking for attention, and keeping things moving. But fine also hides exhaustion, unresolved stress, and quiet loneliness. When emotions were never explored out loud, they learned to stay compact. Generation X isn't emotionally cold. They care deeply. They feel intensely. They're loyal, reflective, and resilient. But their emotions were trained to stay internal. Expression was optional. Stability was mandatory. So instead of emotional sharing, they developed humor, irony, detachment, and observational distance. These became emotional tools, not walls, tools. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. If any part of this feels familiar, let me know in the comments. Not to explain it, just to acknowledge it. Sometimes recognizing the pattern is the first form of connection. Up to this point, we've looked at what emotional disconnection looks like, but to truly understand it, we need to examine how parenting styles shaped emotional habits. how workplace culture reinforced silence, and how technology complicated connection rather than fixing it. That's where we're going next. Parenting styles played a quiet but powerful role in shaping Generation X's emotional world. Many Gen X children grew up with parents who believed in toughness, independence, and emotional restraint. Not because they didn't love their children, but because that's how they themselves were raised. Affection existed, but it wasn't always verbal. Support existed, but it wasn't always emotional. Love was shown through responsibility, provision, and sacrifice, not through emotional dialogue. So children learned early that emotions were private. If something hurt, you handled it. If something scared you, you pushed through it. If something felt overwhelming, you didn't make it visible. Over time, this created a generation that could endure almost anything, but struggled to ask for help. Many Gen X parents practiced what could be called hands-off resilience. Children were given freedom. They were trusted to manage themselves. They learned independence early. But independence without emotional guidance often turns into emotional isolation. Without language for feelings, emotions don't disappear. They go underground. As these children grew into teenagers and adults, that emotional pattern followed them. At work, in relationships, in moments of crisis. The workplace became one of the strongest reinforcers of emotional disconnection. Generation X entered professional life during a period that rewarded emotional control above all else. Competence mattered, stability mattered. Emotions were something you left at home. Showing vulnerability was risky. Needing support was seen as weakness. Keeping it together was survival. So many Gen X adults learned to compartmentalize. Feelings stayed separate from performance. Stress stayed internal. Burnout was normalized. Here's something I want to ask you. Have you noticed yourself handling things alone for years even when support was available? Or do you see someone in your life doing that? Share your thoughts in the comments. You don't have to explain everything. Even one sentence helps recognize a shared pattern. Over time, this created a professional identity built on endurance rather than emotional health. Many became highly capable leaders, but also deeply private ones. At the same time, technology was changing the way people connected. Generation X experienced the shift from face-to-face interaction to digital communication in real time. They learned to adapt. But digital connection didn't teach emotional expression. It offered efficiency, not intimacy. Messages replaced conversations. Updates replaced check-ins. Presence became optional. For a generation already trained to keep emotions internal, technology made distance easier. You could stay connected without being emotionally exposed. You could respond without revealing much. You could maintain relationships at a safe emotional distance. Over time, this reinforced an already existing pattern. Connection without vulnerability. Communication without depth. Availability without intimacy. In personal relationships, this created a quiet struggle. Generation X adults often want closeness, but closeness requires emotional risk, and emotional risk was never modeled as safe. So they may withdraw during conflict, avoid emotional conversations, struggle to articulate needs, appear distant when they are actually overwhelmed, not because they don't care, but because emotional exposure still feels unfamiliar or dangerous. Many learned that staying composed was more important than being understood, and that belief shaped how they love, how they argue, and how they cope. This disconnect often shows up later in life, in moments of loss, in burnout, in midlife reflection, when the strategies that once worked stop working. Self-reliance becomes exhaustion. Silence becomes loneliness. Distance becomes isolation. And that's often when the question arises, why does connecting feel so hard? The answer isn't that Generation X lacks emotional depth. It's that they were trained to survive without relying on emotional connection. And that training was reinforced at every stage of life, at home, at work, and in the way the world began to communicate. But there is one moment where this pattern becomes clearest, one realization that captures the emotional experience of Generation X more than anything else. And that's where we're headed next. For many in Generation X, the turning point doesn't come suddenly. It comes quietly. It appears in moments when silence feels heavier than usual, when productivity no longer distracts from exhaustion, when independence starts to feel less like strength and more like distance. Often, it arrives during midlife, not as a crisis, but as a realization. They begin to notice that they've handled everything alone for a very long time, that they've been reliable, composed, and resilient, but rarely emotionally seen. This is where the emotional disconnect becomes impossible to ignore. Not because something new is wrong, but because something old has finally surfaced. Many Gen X adults describe this moment similarly. They say they feel tired, but can't explain why. They say they feel lonely even when surrounded by people. They say they feel disconnected, but don't know from what. What they're often experiencing is emotional backlog, decades of feelings that were managed, minimized, or postponed. Not suppressed aggressively, just quietly set aside, because there was always something more urgent to handle. A job to do, a family to support, a responsibility to carry. So, emotions waited. And now, they're asking to be acknowledged. This is not weakness, it's delayed processing, and it's incredibly common. One of the most striking insights from psychologists who work with Generation X is this. Many of them don't lack emotional intelligence, they lack emotional permission. They were never told it was okay to slow down emotionally, to ask, to unpack, to need. So when emotional awareness finally surfaces, it can feel confusing or overwhelming. Some mistake it for failure, others see it as loss of control, but it's neither. It's awareness catching up. This is also where misunderstandings between generations often happen. Younger generations may interpret Gen X's emotional distance as coldness or avoidance, but from the inside, it feels very different. It feels like caution, like emotional economy, like not wanting to create problems where none are visible. Generation X learned that emotions were manageable only when contained. So even now, many hesitate before opening up. They measure the cost. They ask themselves whether it's necessary, whether it's worth it, whether it will change anything. And often, they choose silence. Not because they don't care, but because they've lived most of their lives proving they can handle things alone. What's important to understand is this. Emotional disconnection was never the goal. It was the outcome of adaptation, a reasonable response to an environment that rewarded stability, endurance, and self-control. Generation X did what they needed to do to survive and function, and they did it well. But survival strategies don't always translate into emotional fulfillment. What once protected them can now limit them. Not because it was wrong, but because the context has changed. Today's world values emotional openness, psychological language, connection through vulnerability. And that can feel foreign, even intrusive, for a generation that learned to keep emotions internal. This doesn't mean Generation X can't reconnect, but reconnection doesn't look like sudden emotional openness. It looks like small shifts, naming feelings privately, allowing emotional pauses, recognizing that independence doesn't cancel the need for connection. It looks like understanding, not fixing. And that understanding is powerful. Because when people understand where their patterns came from, those patterns stop feeling like personal failures. They start to make sense. And that's the real purpose of this conversation. Not to change Generation X, not to criticize it, but to explain it. Because emotional disconnection doesn't define who they are, it explains how they learned to cope. And when coping is understood, it no longer has to operate silently. If this video resonated with you, here's what you can do next. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future deep dives into generational psychology, mental health, and identity. And if you want to continue exploring, click to watch the next video where we uncover emotional patterns in another generation, helping you see how time, environment, and upbringing shape who we become. Because identity isn't formed in isolation. It's shaped by time, by environment, and by what we were taught to feel or not feel.